This will be jointly presented by Beth Orcutt and Julie Huber. Many of you will already know Beth and Julie from C-Debi, especially if you've joined our webinar series previously. So Beth Orcutt is a senior research scientist in marine microbial biogeochemistry at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. She's a member of the executive committee and scientific leadership team of C-Debi, and she's a co-organizer of these virtual meeting series. Beth's the director of the new Cobra network that we're going to be hearing about today. And we're also joined by Julie Huber. She's a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and she has expertise in marine microbiology, biogeochemistry, and genomics. Much of her work focuses on the subsea floor biosphere and deep sea hydrothermal vents. Like Beth, Julie is also a member of the executive committee and senior leadership team of C-Debi and is the associate director of the new Cobra network. So let's hand over to you, Beth and Julie.
Great. Thank you so much, James, for the introduction. And thank you to everybody who has joined today to hear about Cobra. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So the presentation today will mostly be by me. Julie's not feeling so great, but we'll get Julie to chime in the Q&A session. So thanks again to everybody for joining, and a reminder that this part is going to be recorded in case there are folks that are interested that couldn't join, and then we'll stop the recording for the Q&A session. So today I'm going to talk about what is this new Crustal Ocean Biosphere Research Accelerator that we call Cobra, and how it connects to deep sea and subsurface research and moving that forward to address societal issues. If you have any questions that you want to follow up with me about, these are our tools. And if I could just ask everybody who's not talking to please mute their microphones so we don't have background interference. Thank you. Before I get started today, I just want to acknowledge where I'm coming from, since not everybody knows where I'm coming from in this virtual space. So I'm at the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences, which is based in Maine, which also has a connection to the indigenous communities here in Maine who consider this area Wabanakakik. And I want to thank both the modern and ancestral caretakers of this land, because Maine is such an amazing place to be and do my work. And so I'm very thankful and wanting to acknowledge that. In case you're not familiar with Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Science, where I'm based at, it is a nonprofit research institution, kind of like Woods Hole, but a bit smaller. And our mission is to study the foundation of global health, ocean health, and use our discoveries to improve future for life on all planets. And if you would like to know more, please contact me. Okay, so many of you here today are part of the C-Debi research community, and you may be wondering about what Cobra is. And some of you may be new, you have no idea what C-Debi is. So I want to introduce both of those things. And really, C-Debi, the Center for Dark Energy Biosphere Investigations, that's been around for about 10 years now, really what it did was nurture a community of scientists and students to become experts in the deep biosphere, the subsurface of both the oceans as well as the continents. And it's such a pleasure to join up with this community in these meetings. And throughout this 10-year C-Debi program that was funded by the National Science Foundation, this community became the experts, really, in understanding what organisms live in the subsurface and how they're connected to life in the connected to life above the subsurface. So in the oceans, on the surface of the earth. And I love this schematic that Rosalind made about thinking about the marine subsurface here on the left. You've got the life that lives up in the surface ocean, you've got the life deep in the subsurface, and those are connected, and that is what this community has become the experts in understanding. We've also become the experts in understanding and documenting the roles that this life plays in global biogeochemical cycles. We are a community of experts in thinking about subsea floor fluid circulation and microbe, mineral, water interactions, and how all these systems are connected. And more importantly, we've developed a community of experts that know how to do seafloor and subsea floor research. This is really important because this knowledge that is in this community is urgently needed to inform emerging industrial uses of the subsurface and the deep sea. And in particular in habitats that we are calling the crustal ocean biosphere. So what does that mean? This is kind of a new grouping of words, crustal ocean biosphere. What am I talking about? So if we were to look at a map of the seafloor, remove all the water so we can see it, right? There are these underwater mountains, underwater ridges, right? These are all places on the seafloor where rocks are created. Sometimes they get buried in sediments, but there's a lot of rocky material at the bottom of our oceans. These environments can be hosts for really dynamic processes where you have hydrothermal fluids coming out of the seafloor, really rich in dissolved chemicals, supporting really unique animal ecosystems. But it's not just these charismatic high temperature environments that you would find at vents. There's also low temperature, deep sea rocky environments like seamount systems, where on recent dives, new discoveries of animal associations and animal behaviors are still being documented in these rocky environments. So here's an example of a Dorado outcrop, which is offshore of Costa Rica, where there's low temperature fluid like leaping out of the seafloor and an association of octopus brooding their eggs in those spots. And though it was only recently discovered, right? So, and it's not just the surface of the ocean either. If you take a cross section to see below the seafloor, you would see that there's water movement below the seafloor, connecting environments with one another. And as that water moves through the seafloor, it reacts with those rocks, it gains heat from the interior of the earth. And so it's not just the processes on the seafloor, but also what happens in those rocky environments below the seafloor that is important for considering chemical reactions in this environment. As a microbiologist, I really care about the microscopic life that is attached to these rocks as well, because it's not just the animal ecosystems in the deep sea, but also microbial ecosystems that are part of these processes. So I like this picture that was taken on a cruise to the volcano shore of Hawaii, because it visually shows some of the microbial processes that occur in rusting these materials, microbes that can use reduced iron to create rust and get chemical energy from that process to grow. And so for those of you who might be joining the call that don't think about microbiology at all, I want to center what I'm talking about, because it is an important part of what Cobra is going to be and what C-Debi has focused on, which is understanding these microscopic organisms that live on these rocks. And we can't really figure out who they are and what they're doing just by looking at them. We have to use all kinds of techniques. But the important thing I want to emphasize for those of you who are not experts in microbiology is that, like, what do I even mean when I'm using these words? So microbe really just is a term to refer to anything that's small and that you need a microscope to see. And it can refer to a vast diversity of life. It includes unicellular organisms like bacteria, which are both good and bad, right? They're not all bad. Also, tiny organisms called archaea, viral particles, even microscopic eukaryotic life like fungi. All of those are kind of grouped in this category of microbes when we think about the deep sea. And what I'm really excited about, why I care about these microbes and want to study them, is because they're really cool chemists. They can do so many different chemical reactions compared to most larger life. That really kind of sticks to the trick of using oxygen to respire and burn carbon molecules that they've taken up from the environment. Microbes can make new organic carbon from carbon dioxide. They can breathe all kinds of chemicals like oxygen and nitrate, metal oxides, et cetera. And so they can get chemical energy to fuel their life. And this is really important for thinking about their impacts in the deep sea. So the crustal ocean biosphere, if we were to think about it as a cross section through the seafloor, there are kind of 4 different habitat types that I think about, ranging from on the left, these active hydrothermal vent systems where you have mid-ocean ridges being pulled apart, and you have creation of new rock environments in these hydrothermal vent systems. As those systems move off axis or move off of a hotspot, they become inactive, but those deposits that formed are still there. Those rocks that formed are still there. They're just not hot anymore. As you move even further away, you've got underwater mountains that are surrounded by sediments where rocks can be exposed. And then out in the abyssal plains, you can have areas where rocks precipitate on the seafloor over geologic time in the form of what are called polymetallic nodules. All of those are different types of rocky environments on the seafloor that are part of what we're considering for this new Cobra network. In all of these environments, there's an association of life with those environments. So in active hydrothermal vent systems, again on the left, because of that hot water and the really interesting chemistry there that can support a diversity of microbial life, microbes are really essential for supporting the base of the food web at those environments, because animals have adapted really unique symbioses with those microbes to be as a form of food. They're almost like microbe farmers. And then in other environments, you may not have such a strong association of microbes and animals in symbiotic forms, but microbes are still performing important functions like creating new food by converting carbon dioxide to organic material, recycling nutrients, recycling metals. And so the interaction of life with these crustal ocean environments is very deeply connected, in addition to all the animals that are in these spaces. So if we were to zoom in on one of those environments and kind of think about what do microbes provide? What are the services that life is providing in these deep sea ecosystems? Again, C-Debi as a community has really contributed to understanding what the diversity of life is, what are some of the processes that life can do. And with Cobra, we're trying to think of these in a slightly different framework, of putting them into this framework of thinking of some of these processes as services to an environment, using a framework developed for the Millennium Development Goals about 2 decades ago, in trying to categorize these things as provisioning services, like making new food as primary production, supporting services, regulating services, so that values can be ascribed to what these things are. So let's give some examples. I've already talked about primary production as one of those services where microbes can use chemical energy to convert carbon dioxide to organic carbon. Another type of provisioning service is the transformation of organic carbon to make it easier for other organisms to use. So microbes can, for instance, break down a complex carbon and turn it into more simple forms like proteins going to amino acids. Microbes are also an amazing reservoir of genetic diversity and genetic resources that could potentially be used and harnessed to, for instance, create new antibiotic compounds, new anti-cancer compounds, cosmeceuticals, nutraceuticals, et cetera, because there's such a large diversity of life in these systems. So those are just some examples, but the main point I want to leave you with is that for all of these, we have very few data points to actually then ascribe values to these and try to assign, like, what are the magnitude of these processes in the system. So this is really what's motivating some of the work that we're doing within Cobra, is try to address some of these knowledge gaps. Because there's an emerging interest in trying to harness the deep sea as resources for humans. And so what I want to focus here on first is an emerging industry called deep sea mining. And I highlight this activity around the areas where manganese nodules or polymetallic nodules form, because that's one of the environments that's of focus for this emerging industry. So what is this, right? When I was a student, I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was, this was kind of presented as like something that could happen, but in a very sci-fi way, right? So these were the kinds of images of, like, we would build some kind of robot, it would go along the seafloor, pick up rocks, you know, and it all looks nice and clean. There's no like sediment plume here. There's no animals that could potentially be threatened, right? It was really presented as sci-fi. But that condition has changed dramatically in the last 5 years or so, because why do people even want to mine the seafloor? The interest is in collecting rock samples from the seafloor because they have relatively high concentrations of metals and critical minerals that are have economic value, right? So some of these rocks, this is an example of a manganese nodule, and there's interest in compounds in it like cobalt, et cetera. And if you were to look at a comparison for like a mine on land, some of these are considered like ore grades for these concentrations of these critical metals. And we all know, right, that there's an increasing demand for technologies to move us away from fossil fuel use. So electric vehicles, solar panels, windmills that transfer their energy to big battery packs, all of our devices, right, that have lithium-ion batteries. There's a lot of demand for these critical metals that are relatively rare and hard to find. And so because of that, there's an increase in the price for these metals to drive the interest in looking for other sources of them. And when I was a student, it was sci-fi because it would never be economically viable to go get this from the seafloor. That condition maybe has changed based on some economic viewpoints. So there's an interest in going into these environments, collecting rocks to get those metals and use them for our life on land. It's not sci-fi anymore. This industry is rapidly accelerating. This is a picture of a prototype machine that was demonstrated earlier or in 2021 to explore for the collection of nodules. There are many other examples of this. This is just one, right? But there's a lot of industry interest and fundraising related to trying to design this kind of the equipment needed for this kind of industry. And so again, I want to focus in on one of those spots for those of you who don't have a lot of background in this and kind of talk about like what is the modern state of this. So again, focusing in on a manganese nodule area and some of the work that's happened in those spaces. Because of this interest, there's also an increasing interest from the scientific community to kind of understand these environments. So there's been a lot of work in polymetallic nodule regions to understand the diversity of life in those ecosystems. And so there's been several papers recently, here's just one example, trying to document what lives down there and finding actually there's a lot of variety of organisms, some species that are new to scientific understanding, and importantly, a very clear association of these animals with the rocks. These animals, many of these animals do not like to live in the sediment nearby the rocks, they want to be on the rock. For the growing. And so if you were to remove those rocks, it might be difficult for those animals to survive. And so as part of this work, there's been international efforts to try to understand like what mining impacts could potentially be in these deep sea polymetallic nodule regions. And some of those studies actually started decades ago, even though the idea of this industry was very much in its infancy. And so some of these early projects went to some of these polymetallic nodule regions and did kind of experimental removal of manganese nodules with a plow or something like that. And then those sites have been revisited over the recent years, so several decades after those initial impacts to see like what happened. Did these ecosystems recover? And here is an example of one of those studies. So this was a study done revisiting a site 35 years later, and environments with manganese nodules that hadn't been disturbed. You can see an example of that in the top left. You can also see some animals in those frames. In the top right, you see an example of seafloor that doesn't have manganese nodules, but it still has evidence of animals living in that environment, and you can see them because of the little trails that are left in the sediment surface. By contrast, if you go back to an environment that had previously been where the nodules had been removed, you see that there is not evidence of animal recovery in those systems. Either you don't see a lot of these trails, it looks just like it did when they disturbed it. So these are important new baseline understandings of within human lifetimes, it will be difficult for these ecosystems to recover to their pre-disturbance conditions, we don't yet know if there are remediation impacts, like if we, for instance, put down other kinds of rocks to help the areas recolonize. There aren't yet data from studies like that to help us understand that. A few years ago, as part of C-Debi, a group of scientists met together to kind of think about, like, so there's been a couple of studies about the impacts to animals, but what about the impacts to microbes and what microbes provide in these ecosystems, and how susceptible might those processes be, and could these systems recover? And this was kind of a qualitative exercise that we did that was published in Limnology and Oceanography 2 years ago, kind of giving an estimate of, in these different deep sea habitats, what those services might be, how vulnerable they might be to change, but there were really few data points to guide this. Since this paper has come out, there's been a really great study on this topic that was again done in an area that had been experimentally dredged as a mining prototype. And so what this data is showing you here is comparing sites where there hadn't been previous disturbance, there were still manganese nodules, to an area that had been disturbed over 26 years before in orange, and then a site that had just been disturbed within a few weeks in red. And what I'm showing you one example of the data that was generated in this paper, looking at that primary production, the conversion of carbon dioxide into organic material. And what you can see very clearly by eye here is that the sites where there has been disturbance, those have much lower microbial processes than the sites that were previously that were not disturbed. And even after decades, there's still a noticeable impact. So even at the microbial level, there's an increasing evidence that there could be important impacts to the microbial ecosystem in these crustal ocean habitats. And so that's part of what's guiding the motivation for Cobra. And just again, to kind of give you the latest and greatest of where this field is at, there's been a lot of focus on an area in the Pacific Ocean called the Clarion-Clipper-Dixie zone. This is an area that has these polymetallic nodules. And so there's a lot of industrial interest in this region. There is a program called the International Seabed Authority that has the authority to give basically license to states and contractors to explore these regions for their manganese nodule content. And here's a picture of, in 2018, this is already several years dated now, of how much of the seafloor has been licensed for this exploration work. Laterally, this is about the same distance from west-east as if you were to overlay this on the contiguous United States. So this is a very large part of our seafloor that is potentially being considered for exploration for these nodules, to give you an idea of the spatial potential for impact. And just in the last several months, there's been a lot of movement in this space. So earlier this year, several companies announced a moratorium that they would not accept any metals that had come from deep sea mining until deep sea mining can prove that those metals are sustainably harvested. I've already talked to you about how several programs are building prototypes trying to see if this is feasible. And then also on the political level, there's a push to try to develop a mining code in the next 2 years. So that this work could proceed at a relatively fast rate. That's not the only emergent industry that could potentially be impacting the crustal ocean biosphere. Another one is the topic of subsea floor carbon sequestration. So I'll focus in a little bit on that. Again, one of the drivers for this new industry is related to our global warming problem of having too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And so a potential strategy is to try to capture CO2 and put it below the seafloor to help remove CO2 and help limit global warming. So conceptually here, and I'm borrowing these figures from Solid Carbon, which is a consortium based in Canada, with the idea of trying to concentrate CO2 and inject it below the seafloor where it will precipitate as carbonate minerals and basically be removed from communication with the atmosphere. There are already some prototype projects that are working on this. So here's an example from the Cardfix project, which is based in Iceland, both trying to demonstrate this work on land as well as offshore. This is another potential industry that we're trying to think about. How could the injection of CO2 impact the biosphere in these environments? And what do we need to be thinking about? So what do we need to be doing as a scientific community to participate in these conversations? What we proposed in Cobra is that some of the big knowledge gaps that we need to help address are trying to quantify the services that the crustal ocean biosphere provides so that they can be properly ascribed a value. We need to understand the resilience of these communities to perturbation. Will they recover? Under what conditions will they recover? What will recover and what won't? We need to understand cost-effective strategies to provide early warning and also to understand what is serious harm versus just a little bit of harm. To do all those things, we need to have a bigger community of deep sea scientists and stakeholders engaged in this work. And we need to be engaging those stakeholders in these conversations. And so that is what Cobra is meant to help address. This is a virtual network of networks, because we're not the only ones working in this space. This network was funded recently by the US National Science Foundation through their AccelNet program. It just launched a few months ago. We're still in the spin-up phase, so you're hearing about this very fresh. At the bottom of the slide, I'm showing you the community that is involved in this work currently. So I am the director of Cobra. Julie Huber, who you've already been introduced to, is the associate director, and Rosalind Sylvan is our managing director. And you will have already heard at the beginning that a lot of us are related to C-Debi. This is, in my view, kind of an outgrowth of C-Debi, and I'm hoping that our C-Debi community will come along with us. So you'll also recognize some familiar faces from C-Debi, like Andy Fisher and Jeff Wheat, who are also part of our leadership team and have been part of the leadership team for C-Debi for the past 10 years. Also, Jim McManus, who has a background in deep sea geochemistry, is part of this team, as well as Randy Rotian from Boston University, who brings an amazing wealth of experience with deep sea biology, corals, et cetera, as well as trying to promote equitable engagement in deep sea science. When Cobra was proposed, we had an initial group of partners and networks, but we are very open to others. So the initial partner team includes participation from Ocean Exploration Trust and the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and trying to leverage telepresence activities and some of the training activities, et cetera, as well as Ocean Networks Canada, and other academic programs like at the University of Bergen in Norway with their Center for Deep Sea Research, and the Cluster for Ocean Flora at Marum in Germany. We also have participation of the Global Marine Minerals Project at the USGS here in the United States. And then at an international scale, we've also got programs like Challenger 150 as a partner in this work, and the Minerals Working Group of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. Because Cobra is so connected to a lot of the work that's happening in both of those spaces. So what will Cobra do? Our mission is to accelerate research on the structure, function, resilience, and ecosystem services of the crustal ocean biosphere to inform decision-making. We're going to try to do that in 4 different ways. We're going to try to coordinate, help coordinate work, try to accelerate that work, try to translate that work, and to train the next generation. So a little bit about each of those. We're going to try to help coordinate by helping bring the community together through virtual symposia like this, quarterly annual workshops, organizing special sessions at meetings. And so I'd like to highlight one coming up at the Ocean Sciences meeting in case any of you are participating in that next month. There's a special session on deep sea mining that I'd encourage you to come check out the talks of. and also helping coordinate by just sharing news of what the network partners are doing. We want to try to accelerate the work, again, by using these workshops to help synthesize and coordinate and plan, to leverage telepresence as a way to get more people involved in deep sea research that's happening, because that's a bottleneck. And to support research exchanges of early career scientists so they can, for instance, go to labs, learn new techniques, and bring them back to their home institution. We're going to try to help the translation component of interfacing with policymakers industry by supporting the development of white papers and policy briefs, by supporting our scientists to go to policy meetings and engage with policymakers, and to share information. And so as an example, for instance, here's a picture of Julie participating in a DOSI group that went to the International Seabed Authority and engaged in those conversations. We want to support more of that work throughout the community. And then finally, and one of the things I'm most excited about is the effort to really build a community of international scientists engaged in this conversation. And we want to do that by offering paid training opportunities for early career scientists to learn how to lead deep sea expeditions, supporting peer-to-peer mentoring, and engaging early career scientists in our leadership group to help us decide what is the focus of what we're doing. Part of our motivation for organizing these training efforts is to really try to democratize and make more accessible the assets to explore our deep sea. 98% of the ocean is considered deep sea, and the majority of countries have an exclusive economic zone with deep sea in it, but only 16% of those countries can actually access their deep sea to understand it. And so we want to try to help enable especially scientists and students from countries that don't have their own assets to be able to work and guide the direction of the research, because it's so important to understanding where they live. We also want to be transparent about how we're doing this, and so I wanted to show what the budget is of Cobra in kind of zoomed out view. So in addition to the salaries to support the scientists that are leading the Cobra coordinating efforts, a very large fraction of our budget, our direct costs, are going to these training exercises, because this is something we really believe in strongly, as well as other types of trainings. And again, as I mentioned, supporting things like travel, meeting logistics, getting these publications out, etc. Okay, so the final thing I want to tell you about is this new masterclass that we're advertising and encouraging applications for. This is a masterclass to train and empower early career researchers with the skills and tools so that you can design and propose and execute deep sea field research in a way that is cognizant of informing policymaking and that strives to be as collaborative and just as possible. I want to specify here that in this case, we're defining early career researcher as senior graduate students, postdocs, and junior faculty or junior professionals. That doesn't mean that, for instance, master students, et cetera, shouldn't consider applying. We plan to offer this course 5 times. So maybe you're not eligible now, but hopefully you'll be eligible soon. So please apply. What is this master class? It's meant to be a 10-week virtual training program that's going to run from early March through mid-May. Each week we'll have a series of recorded lectures, maybe an hour or 2 worth of lectures and some materials to read. There'll be a 2 to 3 hour synchronous discussion session for the participants to come together and ask questions and talk with one another and share what they're learning, as well as some short assignments to help the participants build their knowledge. And again, we're going to be bringing in experts to really explain how do you plan these things? How do you get permits? All that kind of stuff. And in this first iteration of the masterclass, we're going to be partnering with Ocean Exploration Trust and an expedition of the Nautilus in April, so that the participants can also interface with that telepresence cruise and learn how telepresence is done and how to engage in that kind of science. This opportunity is open to international participants. It is not restricted to US participants, which is something that we're really excited about. It is also a paid training opportunity because we recognize that having the privilege to just take time off and participating in training is going to exacerbate privilege. And so we want to be able to support everyone to be able to spend the time to participate in this. And an added benefit of participating in this masterclass and being a Cobra Fellow is that you will also, the participants will become co-authors on open access training materials that are developed after the course, so that even participants that can't, or even people that are interested that couldn't participate, can still benefit from the training materials that are provided. We want to build on the foundation of many of the other early career training activities that have happened over the past years, but try to make as much of that material available as possible. So the application period is open now. Please apply. The application period closes in a week on January 15th. If you have a smartphone, you can just show it here and get right to that website, but it's basically cobra.bigelow.org. You will find what you need. It is a simple application. We need some kind of standard biographical information, and we ask for a 2-page CV or resume, and that you answer basically 2 short answer questions to explain your motivation for why you want to apply and be in this masterclass. So that is the presentation. I hope I've given you a good understanding of what Cobra is all about and what we want to try to do. And I am very excited to answer your questions. Again, if you want to just sign up for the newsletter, you don't want to be in the masterclass, you can still just go to the website. If you have questions, cobra@bigelow.org, or reach out to any of those folks here on the screen. And again, thank you to the National Science Foundation for supporting us.